Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is fantastic to have all of you joining us for today's webinar entitled Navigating Our AI-Augmented Future in National Security and Other High-Stakes Domains. For those of you that I've not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Charlie Moore. I also go by Tuna, and I'm a visiting professor at Vanderbilt University, having retired from the U.S. Air Force after 33 years in uniform, and most recently serving as the deputy commander at U.S. Cyber Command. I also have the privilege of being the moderator for today's event. Now, I'm sure that all of us understand that the rapid advancement of AI technology has ushered in a new era of capabilities for the national security sector and other high-stake domains. For example, generative AI is poised to revolutionize these areas by enhancing everything from decision-making to logistics and training environments. However, these advancements are not without risk, including the introduction of security vulnerabilities, the potential for unpredictable system behavior, and the creation of trust deficits between humans and autonomous systems. Additionally, it's very important that as part of this conversation, we have a discussion on the core competencies and skills necessary for professionals to effectively harness the capabilities of AI while we maintain our values and principles. So with that as our backstop, let me now acknowledge that we are fortunate to be joined today by four fantastic members of the Vanderbilt team. And I'd like to take a moment to allow each of them to introduce themselves to all of you before we jump into today's conversation. Let's begin with Doug.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody having a chance to come and interact with us today. I am a professor of computer science at Vanderbilt University, where I've been for the past 20 years. I've had the pleasure of working with the other panelists here for quite a long time on a wide variety of different topics, and I'm excited to get a chance to share our perspectives. I was also most recently confirmed by the United States Senate to become the next director for operational test and evaluation in the DoD. However, the president hasn't yet signed my certificate of confirmation, so today I'll be talking just as a private citizen and a university professor. So welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Doug. Jesse, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. So I'm Jesse Spencer-Smith. I am a director of the Data Science Institute and the chief data scientist. I'm also a professor of the practice of computer science in the School of Engineering at Vanderbilt University. Haven't been here as long as Doug, but I've been working in the AI field for actually a number of decades, and oversee a number of projects here at Vanderbilt, applying artificial intelligence to topics that range from medicine to security to the humanities. Glad that you're here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And Holly, why don't you go next?
Hi, I'm Holly Tucker. I'm professor in humanities and literature here at Vanderbilt. I also direct the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. Each year, we host over 300 events, programs, and meetings at the intersection of the disciplines, from engineering and literature to neuroscience and history. And more recently, we've been doing a lot of programming around AI and the humanities.
Thank you, Holly. And finally, let's go to Jules.
I'm Jules White. I'm a professor of computer science, and I'm the director of the Vanderbilt Initiative on the Future of Learning in Generative AI. So it's a cross-university initiative on how do we train and develop generative AI expertise across campus. And then I'm the senior advisor to the Chancellor on generative AI and enterprise. And so we work with staff groups on building generative AI infrastructure and solutions within the university. And then I've also created an early course, online course on prompt engineering that has about 230,000 people in it.
Great. Thank you, panelists. During today's event, I will be monitoring the live chat and finding questions I think all of you will enjoy hearing from our team of experts about. Additionally, I want to thank all of you that submitted questions during our registration period. So without further delay, I want to jump right into it with some of those questions. So let's begin with something that is foundational to today's subject. What do we mean by generative AI, and what are some examples in high-stakes domains? Why don't we go to Jules for that one?
Yeah, so generative AI, I always say you can think of it like text messaging. So we're all familiar with text messaging. You type in a message and you send it off to a friend, and your friend can text you back an answer, or they can take a photograph and send it back to you. And generative AI works very similarly, except you type in a message called a prompt and you send it off to AI, and AI can text you back an answer. And it turns out that current generative AI systems can be very sophisticated in the reasoning behind those answers. So I think when you start thinking about like use cases, near-term use cases for this in high stakes domain, it would be like looking at and analyzing documents, doing like discrepancy analysis on standards for how we might build, mission critical systems, trying to understand contracts and identify, risky terms, providing sort of like a safety net for humans to help catch things that maybe they aren't seeing, particularly in textual documents, images, other things, maybe not being the first line of analysis, but being that safety net. So I think that's sort of the nearer term sort of use cases. But as we go farther out, we start thinking about these systems are very good at sort of reasoning and responding to the feedback they get. So you might go and tell one, well, we've had this event occur on our network. How should we respond to it? And it might say, well, provide me information about the IP address and what you know about that event, from a cyber perspective. And then it might go and respond and, recommend actions that should be taken. And so as we move out into the future, I think that's the world where we start having more sort of high stakes interactions where we integrate that intelligence into decision making that's either maybe initially providing feedback to guide humans, but longer term, probably taking some actions autonomously to help react faster.
Thanks, Jules. So now let me come back to that same question, but from the national security angle. And for this, I'm going to go to Doug. What are some opportunities for generative AI as it relates to national security?
First thing to remember is that national security, like many other high-stake domains, has a wide range of different capabilities and needs. If you take a look, for example, at law, at healthcare, at other areas where you've got to get the right answers, you can't wait too long, finance services, and so on, national security has many of the same characteristics. One of the first things to remember is with the current state of the capabilities that we have in the Department of Defense and national security agencies and other three-letter agencies, we've got to figure out a way to make people be more productive. There's a great scene from the movie Top Gun Maverick where Maverick, once again, is getting chewed out by a rear admiral for violating a bunch of rules. And the rear admiral tells him, the end is inevitable, Maverick. Your kind, in other words, people in the loop, are headed for extinction. And Maverick says, maybe so, sir, but not today. So when I think about what we're doing in national security, we need to find ways to get people to be in the loop. And we need to be able to do three things. We have to make sure that people are in the loop, not let these systems just run autonomously. We also have to make sure that the people in the loop are using the right tools. There's a wide range of tools. We're going to talk about a lot of them today. And we also have to make sure that people are well equipped with doing prompt engineering effectively. And if you take those three things, the right tools, people in the loop, using the right prompt engineering, you can get very good results out of these systems. However, we have to make sure that we understand the consequences of getting the wrong answers, and also whether or not it's possible to know that we've gotten the wrong answers to be effective in national security. So these days, it's most effective to work on systems where you can tell pretty quickly when something's gone awry, when you get results back from the generative AI, as Jules was just talking about, and also where the consequences of failure are not catastrophic. As long as you keep those things in mind, we're using national security, we're using generative AI for national security in a bunch of different ways, which we're going to talk about here shortly.
Thanks, Doug. And I appreciate any time someone can weave in a Top Gun reference to their answer. So that was fantastic. So next question. We obviously cannot have this conversation without discussing the human role. More specifically, what is the role of humans in the development and use of generative AI? Let me go to Holly for that question.
Yeah, this is where I'm most fascinated. My own research works in emerging technologies. And when I think emerging technologies, we can go anywhere from the scientific revolution to the discovery of electricity. All of these inventions had mighty influence on what we do as a species. So let's just take the electricity. It changed the way we farm. It changed the way we sleep. It changed the way we pace our days. And one of the things that I've been most interested in, the role of the human as generative AI in particular has been rolling out, is the very typical ways and responses that we're seeing to this new technology. There are people who are diving in face first, headlong. There are others who are deeply worried about what this means, not only to our species, but also our entire quest for creativity and intellectual discovery. And then there are more people in the middle who are saying, well, let's just wait it out and see. I think that's why these interdisciplinary approaches are so important, the ones that we're taking here at Vanderbilt, because we're able to look at all the dimensions of it from the computer science, data science, humanities perspective, and then as well as, and I know that we'll be getting to this, the regulatory aspects and specifically how it all of these new technologies contribute to high stakes spaces.
Fantastic. Appreciate that, Holly. So at this point, I think it's fair to say you wouldn't have joined us if you didn't know something about generative AI. But what are some of the existing and emerging technologies underlying generative AI that we should probably discuss? Jesse?
Certainly. So first of all, it's important to understand what's happening with generative AI. So generative AI is based on an algorithm which is a very powerful general purpose learner, right? And so you give it information and it can learn about that information. So that's how we get large language models. We train them on trillions of different words, and so it could learn about the languages and the concepts and the topics that you're actually training the model on. So that's where we started with large language models, but now we have multimodal models. So models which can take and interpret audio and images, and most recently in the last few weeks, video. And this is a powerful way to learn, because then you're learning about the dynamics and the rules of the world. And you're learning that directly from video. And on the flip side, now we have the technology to create as well. So we've been able to create images for a little while now, but now we can create very meaningful and realistic video as well. So models are getting better trained. Smaller models are getting more and more capable. So it's not just the largest models that are held by the big players that are useful. Smaller models are useful as well. And we're also moving into the realm of being multimodal. And finally, we'll go ahead and mention this, even though it's almost a fine technical point. We might need to get into this a little bit later, but models are able to attend to more and more. Used to be that conversation, Jules, you're just mentioning, that back and forth with that texting, you could maybe do a couple of pages of texts. Now you have huge amounts of information you can share with the models and ask for its judgment, synthesis, and working with this information. So that's where we're headed. Multimodal and models that have a long-running attention span, if you will.
Thank you, Jesse. So that's a perfect lead into this question that we saw from the audience, which is, we now talked about what we can use these models for and where we think it's going, but how should we go about making the decision as to whether or not we should use generative AI or these multimodal models in high stakes domains? Is there some type of framework we should be considering? And let me go out to Holly first for that question.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've been seeing more and more is folks trying to understand exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about generative AI and the question of truth, right? The question of accuracy. I think when we're deploying these types of models in high stakes environments, we really need to know what the strengths and limitations of these models are. And I think where one of the main strengths, at least from my viewpoint as someone who works in technology and the humanities, is really providing a different set of eyes to very complicated questions, not meaning to replace the human. I think that's the biggest misperception that we have about what they do. These are not elevated Google searches that we're doing. And we're not expecting 100% accuracy. The models are attending to trillions of different parameters, to trillions of different inputs. And it does not displace the human, but it amplifies what we're able to do. So knowing what we're dealing with and what the strengths and limitations are of the models, I think, is fundamental.
Great. And Jesse, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that we really need to be thinking about augmentation of decision-making, augmentation of the human. We need to have the human in the loop. Think about where these models got their training from. They got that knowledge from us. So understanding what models are trained on, what the models know, and also understanding what models are generating is plausible, given what they've been trained on, given the prompt that you've given, and given the additional information you may have provided to the model. It's going to be providing answers which are plausible and fit with all that it knows and what you've asked it to do. It's not doing a Google search for you, as you're saying, Holly, and it's not necessarily telling the truth because it's been trained. And if it's been trained on incorrect information, if you've given it incorrect information, or if you haven't given it enough, it's going to give you a plausible answer that may be no good. So that's why it's really important to have human in the loop, or as a number of the other panelists have said, other ways to validate what has been produced. Sometimes it's easier to come up and faster to come up with multiple options, some of which may be wrong, and then to validate those. And sometimes that's solution, that validation step and the human in the loop.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. So recently, as we've discussed, we've seen a virtual explosion in the development of these AI tools, especially when it comes to generative AI. I think that logically leads to the question, what are the gaps and risks in using generative AI that need to be filled to make it more effective in high stakes domains? And let me go to Jules first with that question.
Well, I think the biggest gap is education and training. So there's these platforms, these tools are incredibly powerful, but they have this sort of belief that you can just go type in anything you want and it's going to work. And that's not the case. Like, it does take training. It does take an ability to understand how to effectively phrase problems so that they can solve them well and solve them safely. And that training and education is really missing. And that then leads to all kinds of downstream problems where people try to go and solve problems the wrong way or regulate without fully understanding, which could potentially limit innovation. So a simple example is, like, it's all about how you ask the problem, how you phrase it, prompt engineering, as Doug mentioned. So if you can imagine, the Vanderbilt Medical Center has a My Health at Vanderbilt app. Somebody might say, oh, we should integrate generative AI, and you should be able to ask questions like, what was my blood pressure at my last, visit? That's probably not a great use case, because if it gets it wrong, it could lead to a health consequence. But you can actually do that probably safely. You just allow somebody to say, ask, what is my blood pressure? But rather than having it generate the answer, it instead navigates them to the screen in the app where the answer should be displayed. And therefore, if it takes them to the wrong screen, the human's going to look at it and say, hey, I don't see the blood pressure here on the screen. It got it wrong, but there's not a huge consequence. I think another piece of it is that a lot of the rush to think of these systems as replacing humans left out that, how do we think about the human in the loop aspect? And our goal should be to use them in ways that help humans to think more, not less. And so I think we run into a lot of risks when we start thinking of, like, the equivalent of, like, copying and pasting to get the answer, as opposed to giving a human options to consider to widen their perspective on an issue or widen their perspective on some intelligence, rather than telling them this is the pathway, instead saying, like, these are things to consider, pros, cons, other things. Like, the goal is to really help the human think better. And a lot of those aspects of, like, how do we use it in ways that enhance human reasoning as opposed to replace human reasoning aren't being looked at, because there was this rush to think of it as a replacement.
Great. Doug, do you have anything to add to that? I think you're muted.
Thinking about some of the gaps that need to be filled in this space, there are a lot of people, as riffing off of what Jules just said, that thought we could use these technologies as drop-in replacements for human volition and human cognition. Could nothing be further from the truth. So here are 3 things I recommend to do when you're trying to apply these technologies in high-stake domains. By the way, this is the same thing you do anytime you're thinking about doing technology adoption of some new technology. First, you have to figure out, what is your workforce capabilities? Do you have people who are eager learners, want to try new things, or do they just expect something to work out of the box and never question its output? along those lines, we need people who are measured skeptics. They're going to try it out to see if it works, but they're going to trust and verify that the answers make sense. So that's number one, workforce capability. Number two, choosing the right tools, choosing the right LLMs. There's a wide range of LLMs out there. Some of them are free and they're okay. Some of them require some fee. They're typically much better. So in my experience, using the right tools makes a big difference, choosing the right models. For the price of a couple of cups of expensive Starbucks coffee a month, you can get a paid subscription to OpenAI and other LLMs, and it's really worth it. And then the third part that's important to remember for trying to overcome some of these gaps are what characteristics of your domain are you trying to apply generative AI to? There's certain areas where you need 100%, nothing less than 100% counts. Things like being able to do weapons targeting might be an example of that. Being able to generate code or test cases. The bar is pretty high for success. But lots of other things that take place in high-stake domains are currently done very manually with either individuals or large groups of people trying to make sense out of documents. And humans are not very good at that, sadly. And so these LLMs are particularly good at being able to summarize and analyze documents, being able to do things like discrepancy analysis, as Jules pointed out. And so looking for the parts of your requirement space, of your domain, of the environment you work in that lend themselves to these tools is crucially important. So get the right people, train them, as Jules said, make sure you're using the right tools and the right versions of large language models, and then apply them correctly to the right parts of your problem space. That will be very helpful to being successful.
Great, thank you very much. So we've touched on this a little bit several times now throughout the webinar, but let's specifically turn to the human dimension of this topic and address what are some of the specific skills and core competencies needed for people using generative AI in the high stakes domains that we have identified. Let's go out to Holly first.
Yeah, this question is near and dear to my heart, specifically as most of us, all of us here as educators at Vanderbilt. We have a responsibility to make sure that our students understand, as we've been talking about, the strengths and limits of these models, and also the ways in which critical thinking skills are not just needed, they're absolutely necessary to be able to sift through fact and ambiguity in the output, as well as figuring out the best ways to approach the models through prompt engineering. I also think it gets to the vital question of data privacy, data security. What are these, Jesse mentioned it, what are these models being trained on? How does that impact the type of inferences, the output that the models provide us? And where, again, this idea of ambiguities, we have a tendency to think of AI as being on, yes, no, 1, 0, 0, 1. The fact of the matter is generative AI requires, we've been pounding this, is it requires a human in the loop. It also requires humans who have deep ability to be able to live in those gray spaces. It's not something happy making for us to think about, because we would like generative AI to be able to solve our problems, and we'd be able to give commands and orders to it that never require us to engage with it. But when we talk about high stakes environments, I think that the human is going to be critical here, and especially regarding the type of training that we need to do both at the high school, K through 12, high school, college levels, and then fundamentally retraining and expanding the toolkits of people already in the workforce.
Thank you, Holly. Doug, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think, once again, education is crucially important. We need to make sure that people understand the limitations of these technologies. I use them all the time in my work, but I've also luckily gone through an education process where I'm well trained to go out and look for substantiation of anything I read. I think it's very good for everybody to be skeptical of what you read on the internet in general and what you're exposed to through email and social media. And so I think in some ways, those skills are only going to be more necessary as we move into this brave new world of generative AI produced content, where we have things like deep fakes and voice phishing. So there's a lot more opportunities for abuse and a lot more opportunities for people to use these technologies to scam folks. especially elder abuse, elder scams, real serious problem in our country. But everybody has to get to the point where they're really double and triple checking the content that they're getting and understanding why it says what it does, and knowing how to use other resources besides just the internet in order to be able to get second opinions and third opinions on the kinds of things we're doing.
Great. Thank you, Doug. So this next question is always a bit dangerous, but I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask all four of you. Actually, I'm going to go to each of you and ask you to look in your crystal ball and tell me what you think the future of AI might look like. And I'm going to begin with Jules.
Well, I think it's kind of to riff on what a lot of people had said. I think the future of generative AI, and I'll scope it a little bit, is augmented intelligence. So it's not replacing human beings, but it's this human in the loop. And I think one of the exciting things to start thinking about was we develop techniques to teach people how to use it to think better about problems. I think one of the things that's exciting to me is, like, most of the things in technology aren't about improving how humans think through a problem, or don't have the potential to help a human think about a problem or solve a problem or be creative. A lot of it is, a tool that isn't really deeply integrated in that process. And this is something that's very different. It's actually helping people to get wider perspectives. So I always say, people are so focused on AI bias, but like humans are super biased, and we produce that, and we have confirmation bias of data and opinions and things. And so we are only going to see it one way. And a simple thing that AI can do is give you alternate perspectives on an issue, on some data. What are risks? What are things that I'm not thinking through? And one of the things that first times I heard something that really sort of gave me a perspective on how impactful this is going to be is in investment banking. I talked to a group and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to build a private version that we can go and put all of our deal documents in, and we're going to say, act as a skeptic, identify all my assumptions and challenge them. And we're going to send our teams in to work through the weekend, looking through and having all of their assumptions in the deal challenged so that they make a better decision about how they present the material, that they've really covered their bases. And I think that is one of the futures. And I think that's a near term, right now future of, we train people, we get there, and we can help improve decision making. Everybody's focused on like generating Word documents and emails, but would you rather have a faster Word document and email generated, or would you rather have the CEO or the general make a better decision? You can make 20% better decisions. I think that's probably more valuable than 20% faster email.
Great. Jesse, what are your thoughts?
Well, two things I'll point out. One, we tend to project into the future as humans sort of linearly, right? So that's how we sort of track. But actually what's happening with the development of this technology is highly nonlinear. So take anything that we say with a grain of salt, because we can only go so far and we're off the curve. But the other is that I think that we're still playing catch up on what the current capabilities are. So all of the models that you're seeing right now have very similar architectures. And we're now discovering is the emergent capabilities that we've not really been fully leveraging yet. So one of my areas of interest is in-context learning. Models have the ability to, given novel problems and possible solutions, actually work through and help you reason through. This is augmentation of exactly the type that Jules was just talking about. And the other thing is we now have models that have extensive long context windows. That means they can directly attend to many documents all at once, or videos and documents all at once. So if you want to engage, solve problems in a very highly interactive way, this is leveraging and augmenting our capability to reason and to synthesize information, vast amounts of information. We're just scratching the surface of what we can do right now. So I think we're always going to be sort of catching up a little bit about, oh my gosh, I could solve this problem. And that's what we're going to be engaged with for the foreseeable future, is figuring out all the things that we can approach that we could not approach before, even given today's technology, not counting for tomorrow's discoveries.
That's great, Jesse. Doug, what's your crystal ball say?
So I see already in my daily life as a professor and a teacher, doing research, having classes, working with students, I just have to spend a lot of my time doing relatively mundane, routine things until the last year or so, when I've been able to start using generative AI to free me from having to spend my time on the mundane things and give me a lot more time to spend on the really intellectually challenging and rewarding things. I'll just focus on programming as one example because I think this generalizes nice down the road. 20 years ago or so, there was a big push in software development to do something called pair programming. The idea was that two heads were better than one. So if you had two programmers working together to try to solve a problem, they were more likely to find clever solutions, identify bugs or defects, come up with more appropriate ways to solve the problem. The problem is, of course, that somebody has to pay two programmers to do the same job. With generative AI, we're now able to have a buddy who doesn't require pizza or diet beverages with caffeine in order to help us do our work. And I use this all the time in the courses that I create, for all the types of things I do. When I write code, I have a buddy now who works with me and is able to help me think more effectively about doing the job I want to do. And a lot of the stuff I used to have to do by hand that was very tedious and error prone, my AI buddy now does with my help. I don't just turn myself blindly over to my AI buddy, but we work together and get things done much more effectively. So I think looking down the road, we're going to see a lot more opportunities for humans and our AI buddies to work together as collaborators, not necessarily trusted fully, but just like Jules said, we don't always trust our grad students or our colleagues to get things perfect either. But it's going to make us a lot more productive and will allow us to spend more time on the fun parts of what we do rather than getting wrapped around the axle of the more tedious and mundane things.
Great. Very positive view of the future. Holly, what do you think?
Well, I'm an AI optimist too. I marvel, like everyone else, about the things that these models can do, things that I never could imagine. But look, I think we're in our uncharted territory. And coming at this as somebody who's a humanist and not a technologist, I am thinking not just about what more things these things are going to be able to do and how we can integrate them into our daily work. I'm looking at this through the long view of what it means to be in the middle of a paradigm shift. And that's truly where we are in ways that I have never seen it in my research. I work in the scientific revolution, I work in the Enlightenment. And what I know is when you start to have new models for knowing and new ways to communicate that knowledge throughout society, there are many unintended impacts. So while I remain very optimistic, and I may be getting ahead of the discussion, but I think about the scientific revolution and 100 years later that we're looking at the French Revolution. New technologies can unsettle nation-state dynamics. It can contribute to the building of new nation-state formations, can change the economics of trade and the currencies of trade, can create political stability, political instability, and can have very important impacts on human rights. I think that we are barely, and Jesse's even said this, and all of the others in this call are in this every single day, and I think it's fair to say that we're having a hard time keeping up on the onslaught of news that comes out every day and the new models in the last 16 months since they were released. I think that we're not even near understanding what the social impacts will be. And to imagine where the technology is going to be in even a year is hard to imagine. I think where we're going to imagine socially, politically, economically, we might be in the next 10 years. That's anybody's guess.
Great. Thank you, Holly. So just as a reminder, if you have a question for our panelists, you can submit it right into the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. Let me continue with some of the questions that we did get during the registration period. So what are the potential national security implications at the generative AI biotechnology nexus? Doug?
Well, clearly our adversaries are leveraging much of the same technology that we are, and they probably are not quite as worried about some of the implications, the ethical implications and societal implications, such as the ones that Holly just talked about. So I think we have to be prepared for an onslaught of cyber attacks. People will find out ways to use these technologies to create more effective weapons of either minor or mass destruction. And we have to be prepared for that. And so from a national security point of view, it behooves us to keep up with our adversaries, our pacing threats, as they're often called, and make sure that we don't fall behind in the interest of trying to preserve some status quo, falling behind people who are going to use this technology to cause us great harm. So I think we find all kinds of examples in everyday life of disinformation campaigns. Now that we have an election coming along, with the election year, it's going to be even more an opportune time for people to misuse this technology. So as they once said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we have to be very vigilant in how we learn and apply and prepare for attacks against us that are based on these technologies as well, from a national security point of view.
Thanks, Doug. Holly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I concur with Doug. I mean, we at Vanderbilt, we've been looking at different ways that generative AI can be used in phishing PH attacks, and particularly spear phishing attacks. It's stunning how easy and how cost efficient it is to be able to, in fact, some grad students took my profile online and created really convincing phishing attacks that I would click on. So what does this mean when we have tools now that can be put in the hands of bad actors that cost, as Doug said, a few cups of coffee, of specialized coffee each month? And so we really need to be bolstering not just the ways that we can use generative AI for good, but to have a really clear understanding of those people who are not so benevolently minded might put them to use.
Great. So what are the biggest AI associated risks in IP management? Let me go to Jules for that one.
So I think there's certainly open questions about like how the models were trained and what's going to happen. And I think one risk that we have to think about is like, what happens if the most important thing I think of for national security, which is generative AI, if suddenly we can't use these models anymore because we're beholden to a particular copyright decision? What does that mean for us as a country and national competitiveness if, legal, decisions end up limiting our ability to use them and innovate with them? So I think that's one risk in the IP space. And I more think that we have to be very cognizant of that risk if these things do come to pass. I think another risk is when people use them inappropriately and start not thinking when they're using them. So they either do the equivalent of like the lawyers that generated briefs and filed them, which obviously has risk when you go and create something that you haven't fact checked, but it also creates risk if you start generating content that maybe it was trained on that is a violation of somebody's copyright. So if you have people who are using it, but they're using it to generate drafts of things that they then thoroughly edit, think through, a lot of those risks start to be reduced. So I think part of the risk in the IP space also becomes from people not being trained on how to use it effectively and, just taking whatever it says, as is, as opposed to using it as a starting point, more like doing a starting point for research and then verifying facts and things like that. So I think that's another area. And then I think certainly the regulatory space of like, what happens if you go and write software and you're using AI in the process? Like, can you still copyright that software? And rethinking, what does copyright mean and what is the role of the human being? And so I think initially there was a lot of thought that like humans don't do anything in this space. It's the AI doing all the work, therefore it's not authored, by the human and they can't copyright it. But we know really from doing prompt engineering and looking at how people solve problems through conversation that the human has much more of a role. And so we're going to have a more expansive, nuanced definition of what it means to be the author, I think, and rather than looking at it as some negative mark that needs to be cited, think of it as more of, it is going to be an integral role in our work, in our workflows, in producing software and producing written, documents, accepting that and building sort of the regulatory, the IP and other things to support that.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go out to Jesse and ask, what are your thoughts on the need for and the difficulty in identifying the provenance of data to feed the LLMs we're talking about?
Absolutely. As we mentioned before, the models are trained on data. The algorithms that the general purpose learning algorithms that all these models are based on, it's the same across all of the different models that you see right now. The real secret sauce is what were they trained on and how were they trained? So if you don't know what documents and what kinds of data a model has been trained on, then you don't know a priori what that model is capable of. And it's even difficult to measure what the performance of the model is, because maybe it was trained on what you're trying to test it on. So it got to look at that exam and memorize the exam. And so it looks like it's really good at solving, for example, programming problems. But when you change that question just a little bit, you realize actually it's not that strong. This is a huge problem because some of the best performing models that we have available right now are completely closed source. We don't know everything about the architecture. We don't know anything about the data that they were trained on. We have open source models, which are partly open source, but they don't always actually share and state everything that we were trained on. So we still have that problem of what exactly was the model trained on. There are few examples of models where we know everything about all the data that they were trained on. Those models, we can do a much better job of judging what additional training we might need to give to the models, and so we can trust them more. What other types of activities we can take on with the models. Absent that, we're sort of starting from a blank slate, right? We've got to actually figure out strong tests for the models. We have to have a way of assessing how they generalize to new kinds of challenges and new types of problems that we might give to them. It makes it much harder for us to assess how good and how safe a model is if we don't know what data it was trained on.
Thank you, Jesse. So our next question, how can generative AI be integrated into energy management products and software to bolster the resilience and the reliability of critical power systems? And I think what is being asked here is, how can we use generative AI to help secure our critical infrastructure and key resources? And Doug, why don't I turn that one over to you?
Sure, there's a couple different ways to think about this, and I think we can generalize this beyond energy management to almost any critical infrastructure, be it air traffic management or the power grid or whatnot. And first thing to do is start using these tools effectively to serve as faux adversaries. In other words, try to think like our adversaries would think, that are trying to disrupt our power grids, disrupt our air traffic management systems, or other critical infrastructure. And this is something that is done quite a bit in the testing community right now, the operational testing community, where we have so-called red teams that try to find ways to break into systems and cause them harm and bring them down and slow them down and disrupt them in various ways. Generative AI, when trained properly and used properly by the right people with the right perspectives, can be very effective at trying to emulate those kinds of problems, so that then we can have teams of people who go in and try to find ways to thwart those attacks. In the same perspective, you can use generative AI to help come up with novel approaches to defend systems, novel approaches to get a better perspective on cyber situational awareness. A lot of these types of ways of doing this analysis historically has been very manual and very people intensive, which certainly doesn't scale when you think about the magnitude of the threats that we face from around the world, where other actors, the bad actors, as Holly mentioned, are either larger in number or are themselves using advanced technologies to attack our systems. So I think we can use this in a cyber perspective to do a better job of cyber defense, cyber hygiene, cyber situational awareness. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other things we can do to analyze system capabilities, trying to find ways to optimize power capabilities so it works more effectively in different regions. One of the things we've been looking at for decades, of course, have been smart grids, finding ways to be more intelligent about having different kinds of producers and consumers that can be able to sell energy in a market using solar farms and wind farms and so on. And generative AI, once again, can be very effective at helping to do analysis of very complicated combinatorial optimization style problems where people today do it manually, but it just doesn't scale very well. And one of the great things about large language models is it helps to provide a lot of capability and computational thinking in the hands of very smart people who don't have to become programmers themselves in order to get the value of computational thinking. So those are just a few thoughts that come to my mind.
Thank you, Doug. Currently, what regulations exist around generative AI? How are they monitored, and what actions could be taken for non-compliance? Jesse, you want to take that one, please?
I'll start out with that. There are very few regulations. So, and the regulations that are under consideration are very likely aimed in the wrong direction. So early on, the belief was that a model had to be large in order for it to be useful and therefore dangerous. what we're finding now is that the estimates for how large a model has to be before it can have really significant capabilities was vastly overstated. So now we're seeing much smaller models that have similar capability to larger models, so that the whole idea of regulating based on the size of the model is turning out to be a fool's errand. So in the US, there's very little which is guiding and which is in the way of regulation. And this has both the effect of freeing innovation, but also of making people wary as well. Because now you have the problem of if you create a tool or if you create software, as we were talking about before, using models, then what exactly are the downstream effects? Are you going to be regulated out of existence if you put the effort in and the resources in to create these resources? So it's a double-edged sword. With fast-moving technology, especially with technologies such as this, where we're just now learning what the scaling laws are and what the capabilities of the models are, it's very difficult to regulate. And I'll give you one solid example of this. A lot of the work has been around what size models or what type of training you might do with models. But it turns out that there's an entirely different way of using these models, using something that's called in-context learning. And this is where you present a model with a problem, and as it is running, it helps you solve the problem in real time. Is this training? No, this is not training a model. And yet, are you solving problems and actually taking on creating new capabilities of the model? Absolutely, you are. How are you supposed to regulate something where it didn't exist the moment before you hit enter and the model started to create the solution for you? So I wish I had an answer for you, but my answer is it's tough and we've been misguided.
Fair enough, Jesse. Thank you. Holly, what are your thoughts?
My biggest concern is the confusion I'm seeing in the public sphere about what AI is. Because we've been focusing in this webinar mostly on generative AI, but AI has been around for decades. AI is in the algorithms for Amazon, for the Google searches. If anybody has a robo vacuum at their home, that's all based on machine learning, right? And that is part of the bread and butter of what our colleagues Doug and Jesse and Jules are doing in the School of Engineering that bring extraordinary benefits to society and that also underlie in Tuna, in the military. I mean, so much of the weaponry, the air systems, the control systems, I'm speaking, out of my area of knowledge, but rely on machine learning. And so this new push towards AI regulation could have a negative effect if we don't know what we're trying to regulate. And if we try to do any type of blanket regulations, that's my greatest concern, is misperceptions in the public sphere.
Thank you, Holly. So we've touched on this a couple times, but I want to get more specific. What role does the education sector play in a world where the rules change so quickly? And let's go out to Jules first.
Yeah, well, I think certainly the rules are changing very quickly, but I think at the end of the day, the fundamentals are still there. So like Jesse's talking about the algorithm behind them. I mean, these things have been around for a while. I think a lot of what we learned about prompt engineering from the very beginning, still holds today and will hold. And so I think the education space, one of the things we do is we both disseminate knowledge, but we're also creating knowledge through research. So I think part of the important role that we play is going and producing that knowledge, but then taking it, particularly in such a fast-moving space, and getting it out into the world. So discovering, as Jesse said, we're behind in teaching people how to take advantage of all of the capabilities that we already have. We're also behind in discovering all these capabilities because such a large landscape of possibilities was opened up. And so I think we play a crucial role in sort of discovering how to use these technologies effectively, how to then package it, communicate it, and teach it to people. And so I think that's a critical thing. And if I looked at and I had to put my finger on what is the biggest missing piece in I'm just going to focus it down to generative AI right now, I think it's education, because people don't know how to use it effectively, don't understand what it is, to Holly's point, and then that creates all kinds of issues downstream in terms of regulation, our ability to innovate with it nationally and within organizations, our ability to, just overcome the fear of it and all these other things. So I think that educational gap is huge and a critical problem. And that's a really important place for, universities to, and also just all educational institutions to play, is to help fill that gap.
Great, thank you. Holly, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree that it's urgent. I also agree. I think that we have a lot of humility that we need to find because I've discovered that my students, if we look at our students as co-learners with us, it's extraordinary the things that they can come up with, some of the larger social questions, and even the tools and techniques. Jules, I'm sure you've been finding in the AI courses that you're teaching with Jesse and Doug, it's extraordinary what our students can think up and the types of questions they can be asking that we haven't even thought to ask because we're living in different contexts. And I think that in this era of generative AI is we all need to show humility and a willingness to learn, as well as a lot of attentiveness to what we're building, what we're doing, what we're asking, the questions that we're engaging in, what the downstream effect of this will be, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and long after we're gone on society.
Thank you, Holly. Okay, I really like this question because I think it really gets at the heart of the matter of an issue that's continually coming up, especially in the last few years. How do we proactively balance innovation and regulation, or should we prioritize one over the other? Now, if we have time, I'm going to go to all of you, but I'm going to begin with Doug.
So obviously it depends on what it is we're trying to regulate. If we're trying to regulate nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, there may be a different answer. For generative AI, I think it's absolutely crucial that innovation has to lead the way. Various other people have pointed out that if we let regulation get in the way of innovation prematurely, two things are going to happen. First, there won't be anything to regulate because we won't have innovated. And number two, thinking again, particularly through a national security lens, our adversaries are not going to be constrained and restricted in their use of these technologies for all kinds of untoward things that will do us harm. And if we're not careful, we're going to put ourselves at a major disadvantage because they will find ways to use this technology at our expense, and we will be not incapable of being able to respond because we've regulated ourselves out of competitive advantage. So that's part of it. At the same time, of course, that doesn't mean it has to be the Wild West where just anything goes. The challenge, of course, is we already have lots of laws on the books that people don't really know how to apply effectively because technology almost always runs ahead of the regulation process. But I think what this really calls for is working together with government, with industry, with academia, with culture, with citizens to try to find the right trade-offs and balancing of equities between these different demands. So I think I will put innovation ahead, but that doesn't mean it has to be no holds barred and anything goes. We have to be very thoughtful about the trade-offs there. And there's a lot of issues, of course, with respect to data privacy, which have been around for a long time, but AI and generative AI is simply exacerbating these problems because of what Holly mentioned before, the ability to take public information and fuse it and come up with new ways of being able to spoof and thwart and attack unsuspecting victims.
Thanks, Doug. Jules, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we have to, in my mind, prioritize innovation because we have to see what it's capable of before we can begin thinking about, what are we going to regulate? What do we care about? I think we have to focus on that. And I think, just to the points that have been made by everybody else, I think our adversaries are going to be using it. It's really important that we stay ahead of the game. And if we don't innovate and understand how to use it effectively, we're not going to have anything to regulate. We'll regulate and then we just won't ever innovate. And so I think we have to start with innovation and really lead from that space. And as just to go back to Jesse's point, we're already behind in innovation with the current capabilities of the models. So we need to really focus on making sure we close that gap.
Great. Jesse, do you have anything to add?
Again, to underscore, we don't know exactly what we need to regulate yet because the landscape is changing so quickly, and it may entirely be possible again that it's so fast moving that we simply cannot stay ahead of the curve there. So we need to approach this very carefully. I think that you can look at regulating, and making sure that we understand what's happening with the IP to give guidance to companies, and so we can be sure in our investments and people know that they won't be losing them. But stifling innovation, I think, is a dangerous path for us to take.
Thanks. And Holly, do you have anything to add?
I think I'm more moderate. I think that someone who works in history, who's looked at those moments of people being very spooked by reading glasses and microscopes, should we be seeing this world that we weren't supposed to see? Early blood transfusions that took place in the 17th century, they are animal to human, and there was a freak out because there could be hybrid creatures created. We have to balance societal fear with the perception of harms and the balance of the benefits that it can bring to society. I think after blood transfusion was banned for over 150 years, I think about the lives that could have been saved. But I think all of it needs to be balanced about the ethical dimensions. And again, that balance between harms and benefits. But I agree with all of my colleagues here, is we shouldn't let fear be the guide in the decisions that we make, because there's so much that we can gain out of this new era of generative AI if we are wise and careful in balancing the harms and benefits.
Fantastic. Well, I think that is a great place to leave it because we're unfortunately out of time. I want to once again thank our esteemed panel of experts for joining us and providing us their insights on this very interesting and critical subject. And of course, I want to thank all of you in our audience for joining the webinar today and helping us advance the discussion and overall study of this fascinating topic with your very thoughtful and insightful questions. Also, it looks like you brought the slide. That's fantastic. We have several other events that all of you may find interesting. First is our AI training day. It will take place tomorrow, 5 March, and is designed to enhance your understanding and skills related to AI model training and creating novel architectures. This is a free hybrid event, and you can register at the link on the slide. Also, we have the Vanderbilt Summit on Modern Conflict and Emerging Threats. It will take place at the Nashville campus 17 and 18 April. Additionally, there's an executive education opportunity also on the Nashville campus on 15 and 16 April. Information about both events, including registration, can be accomplished via the links on the slide. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the future events.